But first, hello, my name is Garvin and I read things and blabber about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today, we're looking at the life of one of the most mythologized men in history, Alexander the Great. Before we dive into the myth, though, let's take a look at what we can reasonably believe are the facts of his life. Now, just a quick disclaimer, this is not meant to be a deep and comprehensive look at his life, just an overview. With that said, let's turn to. First things first, let's talk about sources. Now, I am using a number of online sources that'll be quoted in the description below. I am also using the book By the Spear by Ian Worthington, which is a great resource not just for Alexander, for King Philip II, Alexander's father, who doesn't get enough credit, by the way. And if this video wasn't so darn long already, I'd be talking a lot more about him, but I guess that's a conversation for another day. Alexander the Great was born Alexander III of Macedon. He was the son of King Philip II of Macedon and his fourth wife, Olympias. Although I have to note that wasn't her birth name, she was actually born Polyxena, Princess of Epirus, and took the name Olympias in honor of a victory won in the Olympics by one of King Philip's racehorses. Thing to keep in mind is the Macedonian kings practiced polygamy, so King Philip had about 6 or 7 wives, mostly married for political reasons, including her. So their relationship was primarily a political one, but some of the sources do state that there has been real emotion between them, and that might be why their relationship was so rocky. But that's also a subject that could be its own video, so we're just going to run right past that rabbit hole. Alexander was born in the Macedonian capital of Pella. He had an older brother named Aristeus, but due to a mental disability, Aristeus was considered unfit to serve as king, so Alexander was the heir, and he spent his childhood learning to read, play the lyre, ride, hunt, march, and very importantly, fight. The Macedonians expected their kings to be warriors who led from the front, and Alexander was raised from the crib to fulfill that expectation. It was so important that his nurse was the daughter and sister of Macedonian generals, and that his tutors and teachers from an extremely young age were military veterans. Now, at the age of 13, his formal education began when Philip arranged for Aristotle himself to be his tutor. Aristotle had an interesting demand as part of his pay package. He demanded that Philip rebuild his hometown, find the people of his hometown who had been sold into slavery, free them, and resettle them. And I feel like that was fair because Philip was the guy who burnt down that town and sold those people into slavery in the first place. He did that as part of his campaign to conquer the Greek city-states and unite Greece under his rule. Aristotle didn't just teach Alexander, though. A number of Macedonian noble boys were also enrolled in the class, and Alexander at that time also came into contact with the families of Persian nobles who had fled to Macedon as part of the fallout of, shall we say, kinetic political disagreements. Among those Persian exiles was a young girl named Barsine, who is going to show up later, but we'll have to get back to her. Alexander's formal education didn't last that long, because his military career started at age 16. What happened is that Philip had left him in Macedon as a regent, while he headed north to fight a rebellious Thracian tribe. Another Thracian tribe rebelled, thinking to take advantage of this absence, but Alexander wrecked them so utterly that they were driven from their homelands, and Alexander took this opportunity to found his very first city, Alexandropoli. Philip recognized his son's talents and started to make use of him to quell rebellions around the expanding kingdom, and then brought him on campaign with him, including the pivotal campaign of Philip's life. At the Battle of Chaeronea, Alexander commanded the companion cavalry on the left flank, where he isolated the sacred band of Thebes and then cut them down to the last man. Philip used this victory to unite Greece under his rule and then declared his intention to invade the Persian Empire. However, Philip would not live to fulfill that ambition. Returning home from uniting Greece, Philip also announced his intention to marry a young noblewoman of Macedon named Cleopatra, and it's weird how often that name pops up in history, isn't it? Cleopatra's uncle was one of the more powerful men in Macedonia, and he toasted the engagement, and it went something like this.
To the new queen! And may the gods at long last give to Macedonia a legitimate heir to the throne.
Remember the xenophobia, folks. It's gonna be important later. Alexander, as you saw, did not take this well, and it was made worse by the fact that King Philip did not side with his son. And as the argument escalated, it got to the point that King Philip, who was incredibly drunk, pulled his sword and tried to attack his son. However, he was incredibly drunk, so he tripped over his own feet, and Alexander stalked off in somewhat justifiable anger, in my opinion. After the wedding, although long enough after that Cleopatra gave birth to a son, King Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. And while it's long been suggested that Alexander was part of the plot, there's never been any evidence. Although a lot of Greek writers are very sure that his mother was the mastermind of the plot, and she didn't waste any time murdering Cleopatra and her infant son in order to remove a competitor to the throne to Alexander. However, I should also note that ancient Greek writers loved blaming things on powerful women, so we should take their conviction with a bit of salt. On the flip side, Olympias did have the motive, the means, and the opportunity, so I have to admit it's at least possible. Alexander made a big show of punishing people for his father's murder, but that was as much to shore up his own power as anything else. With Philip dead, and Alexander now the only living candidate for the throne, he was turning his eyes to Asia, but first he would have to deal with some rebellious Greeks. Given that the Greeks had only been conquered by force recently, and not long before Philip's death, it's no surprise they rebelled. Also, a number of tribal people under Macedonian rule rebelled as well, but they were very quickly squashed. Thebes made the mistake of rebelling against Alexander twice. The first time, Alexander showed up, demanded their surrender, and when they gave it, he was, by the standards of the time, rather gentle. All he did was install a pro-Macedonian government with a garrison to back them up. The second time, Alexander still showed up and gave them a chance to surrender, but they basically spat in his face and called him a tyrant. Alexander, feeling rather insulted, decided to make an example of Thebes, so he killed anyone who resisted him and enslaved the rest of the city, sparing only the priests, the priestesses, and the descendants of the poet Pindar. He also burnt the city down, leaving only the temples and the house that was said to belong to Pindar standing. If you're wondering why he spared the descendants of Pindar and kept from burning down his house, Pindar had written poems praising one of Alexander's ancestors, who was also named Alexander. I think this shows us a bit of Alexander's personality, honestly. This example, though, did convince the rest of Greece not to test Alexander any further, and left him free to do what he always wanted to do: invade Persia. You could say that Alexander invaded the Persian Empire, but I feel that's an understatement. It's like saying a tornado brushed by your house. Technically true, but really undersells the devastation. In the course of 3 major battles, in where he was outnumbered at least 2-1, and dozens of sieges, he shattered the armed might of the greatest empire in that part of the world in that time in history. The siege of Tyre alone is epic enough to be a video in of its own right, and it's there he took his first major injury, to his shoulder from a stone. After the Battle of Issus, he captured the Persian royal family, although not the great King Darius himself, and he would treat that family well enough that the king's own mother would become rather devoted to him. Although I should note, he was holding her granddaughters in captivity. Gentle, respectful captivity, but captivity nonetheless. So I think it's fair to say that there was some political calculation in her actions, although every source I have states that she starved herself to death out of grief at the news of Alexander's death. So there may have been some genuine feeling there, or Stockholm Syndrome. Given all of this happened 2,300 years ago, it's impossible to say with any confidence. And it's here that Alexander and the Lady Barsine meet again. She had been married to her uncles, who were Greek mercenaries serving the Persians. Her second husband, Memnon, was actually Alexander's greatest opponent in the early stages of the invasion, leading the Persian fleet into an attack on the Greek islands to try and cut off Alexander's supply line, and threatening to incite the Greek mainland into rebellion before he was killed in battle. If she was grief-stricken, she didn't really show it, because upon hearing the news of his death, she ran off to Alexander to seduce him. In fact, a number of writers have suggested that she was the first woman that Alexander had a physical relationship with. This isn't to say that Alexander had never been intimate with anyone before. According to the stories, he had had a number of relationships with men before this. However, she is widely believed to be the first lady he brought to bed, and she would bear him a son named Heracles. Alexander would also be adopted by Ada, the ruler of Caria, a region in Anatolia. She seemed to have taken this adoption seriously enough that she even cooked for him and sent him pastries while he was on campaign, or at least campaigning close enough for those pastries to make it. And he made her a satrap, starting a policy of recruiting local nobles and giving them civic power. Let me explain that a bit. The Persian Empire was divided into regions under the rule of appointed viceroys called satraps. They held massive power, being the final deciders of law in their region, able to gather taxes, and even able to raise and command troops in their own name. Alexander would appoint native nobles to the post of satrap, but he split the power, appointing Macedonian military commanders who would hold all the military authority, and appointing Macedonian or Greeks to oversee collecting the taxes. And this led to resentment from both sides, as the Macedonians didn't like him raising up conquered peoples, and the native nobles resented losing the power to tax and command soldiers. Alexander at this point was trying to find a way to weld the native peoples of the Persian Empire and the Macedonians under his authority, and often sought to compromise between the two. Although, push come to shove, he clearly favored the Macedonians enough to infuriate the people he conquered, but not enough to keep the Macedonians from being upset. Remember that xenophobia from earlier? Macedonians didn't consider the non-Greek people of the Persian Empire to be their equals, and any suggestion that they would be under Alexander's kingship infuriated them. Another irritant was Alexander's pretensions to divinity, which really took off once he took Egypt. Now, the Persians weren't popular in Egypt. They had offended the local religion and the local elites in various ways. For example, butchering literal sacred cows and tearing down Egyptian temples, which will never make you popular. Alexander, on the other hand, fully embraced and supported Egyptian religion and cultural practices, and the Egyptians in turn enthusiastically granted him the titles reserved for Pharaoh, including that of Horus, God on earth. It was here that he also visited the oracle of Zeus Ammon, and claimed that he had been told by that oracle that he was the son of Zeus, and therefore at the very least a demigod. Now, plenty of kings have claimed divinity or semi-divinity in the past, but Alexander seemed to fully believe his claims and expect to be treated as a living god. And this was another wedge between him and the Macedonian army, who had no tradition of treating their kings as gods, and therefore had little patience for such things. After taking Egypt and securing the coast, Alexander turned east and marched to Babylon, considered by many to be the oldest city in the world at this point. And the Babylonians were actually quite welcoming to Alexander. He swore to restore the temple of Marduk that the Persians had let fall into disrepair, before heading into modern-day Iran and seizing Persepolis and committing war crimes. A lot of war crimes. His troops sacked the city, and that includes everything a sack entails, and the Dreadlord algorithm does not like me going into detail about that, and to be honest, I don't like going into detail about it either. Afterwards, the army stayed in the city for 5 months, spending most of it drunk off their asses, and that ended with them burning the city down. Alexander would later justify it as revenge for Persia's actions during the invasion of Greece, but that was another wedge between him and the Persians, and one of many reasons why the empire was so rebellious even when he was alive. Meanwhile, having been run out of Iran and losing the capital, Darius was murdered by his remaining nobles, who turned around and made one of the few remaining satraps, Bessus of Bactria, which is modern-day Afghanistan, their new great king. Alexander saw this as a threat because as long as someone was occupying the office of great king or king of kings, his throne would lack legitimacy, so he needed to make sure he was the only surviving ruler. So he marched his army to the eastern edge of the world, and in a grueling campaign killed Bessus, and then turned around and dealt with a long guerrilla war that was being waged by the locals. In the process of that, he took a head wound during another siege, which inflicted temporary blindness, and then, according to some sources, caused him to have difficulty speaking for months. It's also in Bactria that he met and married his first wife, the Princess Roxanne, who was not a daughter of Darius. At this point, Alexander has advanced further east than any other Greek ruler before him, and he has conquered more territory and possibly more people than any single human being in history before him, but that's not enough, because India is right there, so he's going to march into it and conquer it. The Indus River campaign proved to be too much for his army, and nearly too much for Alexander. While, according to the sources, he crushed every army he faced, he also had his first major mutiny, the Hyphasis Mutiny, which happened after a victorious battle where the army basically declared they had had enough. Now, to be fair to his troops, they had been marching and fighting for almost 10 years at this point. They were tired. Their gear was in shambles. They hadn't seen any family members in almost a decade. They were done. They needed to stop, or at least take a break. During this campaign, Alexander also took a life-threatening injury. While storming a fortress, he took an arrow to his left chest that some believe pierced his lung. With his body severely damaged and his army increasingly reluctant, he finally agreed to turn back, and he led his army through the long march through the Geodrosian desert, losing more men there than he ever did in any single battle. Even when he returned to Babylon, however, Alexander hadn't given up entirely. He was plotting another campaign, this time south into Arabia to conquer Yemen and the spice trade cities. I talk a bit about that in my Iram of the Pillars video, so I'll link that in the description. But while Alexander was plotting future conquest, his empire was shifting under his feet, and Alexander in particular was also growing more violent and erratic in his behavior. I can't help but wonder if he was suffering some lingering brain damage from that head injury I mentioned earlier. You know, the one with the high-speed rock impacting his skull. The binge drinking didn't help either. Now, on top of this, Alexander lost his closest friend, who had also been his first boyfriend, and according to some sources, the first person he had ever been intimate with, Hephaestion. And Alexander requested that the oracles at Zeus Ammon in Egypt grant him a hero cult to be established in Hephaestion's name, and when that request was granted, he threw a giant celebration where he drank vast amounts of wine, including, it's recorded, a full pitcher, which would have been about 12 pints, which is a ridiculous amount of alcohol on its own, but that's just part of what he drank that night. After this, unsurprisingly, he took ill, and then he lingered for a few days, and then he passed away on what is on our calendar June 11th. Now, the reason for his death has been hotly debated for longer than Christianity has been around. Some people have said it was cancer, others say he was poisoned. A lot of people have said he drank himself to death, and I can see why they would say that. And I am going to throw my hat in the ring here. Now, I'm not an expert, but just looking at the injuries I've detailed in this video, and the other things he's doing to his body, the binge drinking, the partying, the unhealthy diet at times, I think he just abused his body to the point that it couldn't take it anymore. Alexander lived like a rock star who was also a pit fighter, so maybe it's no surprise that his body just gave out on him. Whatever the reason for his death, his empire did not survive him. It fell apart, as various generals and nobles and other subordinates all left at the power he had assembled. And because anyone with a marriage or a blood tie was a threat to those people, his mother, his wives, Barsine, his brother, his sons, his sisters, they were all murdered one by one. Despite the gruesome consequences of his death, he did change the world forever. His actions gave rise to the Hellenic Age, where Greek culture and language would achieve a privileged place in the East, and Macedonians would rule from the borders of India to the shores of Italy. As a result of this, he was mythologized, romanticized, and villainized throughout the ages, but the myth of Alexander is next video's topic. It's on this note that I'm going to stop this week's video. This was a fairly bare-bones look at Alexander, his life, and his family, which are all topics that could easily sustain several YouTube channels, all on their own, I think. That said, I hope you found this informative or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing, as that helps me out in my eternal battle with the Dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. You can also join the Everwise at my Patreon, where $1 a month gets you a vote on upcoming content, like this video. Next week, as chosen by my patrons, we'll be looking at the Alexander romance, the story that would carry the mythology of Alexander into the future. I hope you'll join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading!